Standard American history teaches that nullification is unconstitutional. But is this truly what our American founding fathers left us? Did they leave us a government in which we are only allowed to elect a few elites who live in Washington, D.C., and that we, the people at the local level, after that, have no say over how we can control our government? The Constitution was ratified by 13 sovereign states, each acting independently of the other. It was a mutual agreement on the type of government the states would accept. We, the people of the states, acting individually through our states, ratified and created the Constitution. Article 7 of the Federal Constitution plainly documents the fact that only sovereign states were involved in the ratification of the Constitution. We, the people, acted within our own separate, independent, and sovereign states. Article 7 clearly states that the ratification by 9 states shall be sufficient for the establishment of this Constitution between those states so ratifying. Note that those states so ratifying, so out of the 13, if only 9 ratified it, the remaining 4 could not be compelled by the majority to come into the Union. It was an act, a voluntary act of each sovereign state. This graphic explains how the division of powers is taught by the modern American narrative, the narrative that the victor wrote after the war. It demonstrates a federal government that is controlled supposedly by this balance of power between the federal legislative, executive, and judicial. But is that really the only way that we can control the federal government? Is that all our founding fathers left us? No, they left us real states' rights. The states retained the right to nullify federal encroachments of the reserved rights. Look at this graphic. It demonstrates how the original constitutional America was formed. The federal government was in the center. It was controlled or limited by the division of power, true enough, but the ultimate limit on the federal government's authority, the ultimate control of whether or not the federal government was abusing its constitutional authority, was reserved for the sovereign states. Each sovereign state reserved the right to decide for itself if the federal government was acting in pursuant of the Constitution. This left the states with the ability to nullify unconstitutional acts of the federal government. Georgia was the first state to nullify this encroachment of its reserved rights. The federal Supreme Court attempted to compel the sovereign state of Georgia in 1793 to defend itself in the federal court. This was only 5 years after the ratification of the Constitution. Now, the Anti-Federalists had argued against the ratification of the Constitution, among other things, because of the power vested in the federal Supreme Court. They were afraid that the federal Supreme Court would try to lay claim to authority over the sovereign states. Alexander Hamilton, the High Federalist, who believed in a strong central government, he admitted in Federalist Paper 81 that the sovereign state could not be compelled to answer itself in the federal court. It could not be sued by the federal government in the federal courts. The sovereign state of Georgia, upon receiving the subpoena summons from the federal judge, declared that if any federal agent came into the state of Georgia to carry out this federal court's order, that individual would suffer death. He would be counted as a felon, seized, and hung by the neck until dead without benefit of clergy. The federal government then, in 1798, began to oppress First Amendment rights of freedom of speech and freedom of press when it passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. Virginia and Kentucky nullified these acts within their respective states in the Resolves of 1798. The Virginia Resolves was written by James Madison. The Kentucky was written by Thomas Jefferson, both declaring that the state had the right to protect its citizens from an abusive federal government. But the northern states also used the right of nullification. It wasn't just a southern thing. New Hampshire, January the 16th, 1795, in the Susanna controversy, nullified federal efforts. Massachusetts, February the 15th, 1809, in complaining against the Embargo Act, declared it to be, quote, unconstitutional, unjust, oppressive, and not legally binding upon the citizens of this state. An absolute act of nullification. Pennsylvania, similarly, in 1809 in the Olmsted controversy. In Connecticut, August 25th, 1812, in a controversy regarding a federal attempt to use its militia, Connecticut declared, quote, it should not be forgotten that the state of Connecticut is a free, sovereign, and independent state, that the United States are a confederacy of states, that we are a confederated and not a consolidated republic. In 1821, in a controversy with the United States Bank, Ohio's legislature moved to fight the federal government, and it protested against the doctrine that the political rights of the separate states that compose the American Union and their powers as sovereign states may be settled and determined in the Supreme Court of the United States, end of quote. Ohio legislature was saying, look, the sovereign state of Ohio, and only the sovereign state of Ohio, has the right to decide, not the federal Supreme Court, but the people of Ohio, whether or not its rights are being oppressed by the federal government. As late as 1859, Wisconsin and other northern states nullified Article 4, Section 2 of the United States Constitution. This was the article that the Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens of the state to aid the federal government in the capturing and returning of fugitive slaves. The North didn't want to do that, so they passed personal liberty laws that nullified an act of the Constitution. Listen to what the Wisconsin law says. It says the principle that the general government, that is the federal government, is the exclusive judge of the extent of its powers delegated to it, stop nothing short of despotism. The states, being sovereign and independent, have the unquestionable right to judge of its infractions, and a positive defiance of those sovereignties of all unauthorized acts is the right remedy. So we see that originally the American people could look to their states to interpose its sovereign authority between the people's rights and liberties and an abusive federal government. That's called real states' rights. It's because the sovereign states created the federal government. Now, up to 1860, as we've seen, numerous sovereign states had interposed its sovereign authority between the abusive federal government and the citizens of the sovereign states. The so-called Civil War destroyed America's constitutionally limited Republic of Republics as designed by our founding fathers and perverted it into an federal empire in which the federal government is now supreme and we the people mere subjects of an empire. In the past, originally, the federal government and its authority and its ability to abuse its authorities was surrounded and hemmed in by sovereign states. But today, as this graphic shows, we the people of the once sovereign states are now surrounded and hemmed in and limited by a supreme federal government. That's because states' rights died at Appomattox.
Every cultural and ethnic group in America today is encouraged to display pride in their heritage, except Southerners. Sadly, the heritage and rights of Southerners have been relegated to the trash heap of liberal PC society. Justice requires equality and fair play for the South. After all, Southern rights matter. We insist on justice for all Southerners who wore the gray, black or white, during the War for Southern Independence, and justice for their descendants. The Sons of Confederate Veterans is a non-political Southern heritage organization defending the good name of all honorable Southerners. Check out our website and join us in this noble endeavor.